you feel something strange going on, something eerie, if there are ghosts whirring around here, that is Carlotta. Carlotta was my grandmother, and she was the driving force behind the wilderness, and I'll explain how that came about. In the book is divided into 4 parts. Before, which talks about the old wilderness and national and local developments that led up to the possibility and the allure of the Lake Michigan shoreline. The next section is called Before, and is More, and that has to do with the wilderness that you know today. Then, as I wrote that, it occurred to me that there are some segments of the history of the wilderness that didn't come into that history of More. So I created another section and called it More. And so we have now, we have Before, Now, More, and then the final one is a directory of the cottages, and you'll find each cottage by address in sequence, and get a little bit of the history of that cottage. My talk tonight is a mix of those 4 elements. And the first part of that mix is indeed Carlotta. I would love to give you a biography of Carlotta, but we don't have that much time. Just let me tell you that she was born in 1870 on a farm in Muskegon County to a Willis Walkley. Willis Walkley served in the Civil War. He was born in 1846, and this is when he was 18 years old, and served in the medical department. After the war, he came back and decided to try farming, as his parents had done, and he had a farm in Muskegon County. And then he grew disenchanted. He was married. He had married a very young woman just before he went off to the service. They had 3 daughters. Carlotta was the third. As A.E., Carlotta's husband liked to say, was bing, bang, bong, and Carlotta was the bong. She was born in November of 1870. 2.5 years later, less than 2.5 years actually, her mother died. And it was about that time that her father thought he would like to go to University of Michigan Medical School and get a medical degree. But he didn't think he could care for 3 daughters. So he put Carlotta in a foster home in Hillsdale County. Fortunately, they were good people, and they took good care. There was a loving, compassionate Quaker household. And they took good care of Carlotta. She went to Hillsdale Academy and graduated, and she went on Hillsdale College and graduated valedictorian. She and A.E. were married in 1893. A.E. was my grandfather. His real name was Alvin Enoch Ewing, but he was never called Alvin that I know of. He was always A.E. to family and friends, and that is the way Carlotta referred to him. Carlotta, although she lived to be over 100, had a lot of medical problems particularly when she was young, but even when she got older. And in 1910, she went to the doctor, and the doctor said, Carlotta, you have some real serious respiratory problems. You need to go to the Southwest, to Arizona, New Mexico, to get out of this heavy, humid climate in Michigan. And she went back and talked to A.E., and they thought, no, A.E. was an attorney in Grand Rapids. He served in some public offices, and they had 3 children in school. Said, no, we don't want to go there, so let's take an alternative. Let's look for some lakeshore property and get the fresh air off Lake Michigan. It was about this time, too, that there was kind of a national fad to suddenly, opposed to the Victorian period, when windows were closed and they wanted to keep the night miasma out of the house. People started opening windows and getting outdoors. And that's what Carlotta and A.E. decided, and their children too, to take advantage of Lake Michigan. They were in Grand Rapids, and they also, Carlotta had a sister named Emily. And Emily married a Peter Danhoff. Peter Danhoff was an attorney in Grand Haven. Get the links coming along here? And Peter Danhoff had a line on an estate that was being settled that included 60 acres, 30-acre parcels near what is now today Rosie Mound. And Carlotta, they could get this for $300. Lake Shorefront.
Oh my God.
And Carlotta said, yes, I would like to buy that, but I want AE's approval. And AE said, yes, the price is right, as long as I never have to go there. He was joking. He did go there, and he was a lover of the lakefront, just like the rest of the family. So they bought that acreage, and then a friend of Carlotta's, Sarah Worth, bought the 30 acres, half of it from her. And they built a cottage, and you can see that cottage. It's the first picture up here on the far left. And they put the cottages together with a long, long sleeping porch connecting them, or any porch. They dined there, they slept there. Then in 1921, a new opportunity came up. There was 99 acres of land available just a little bit this way from Rosie Mound. And it looked good to Carlotta, and again, AE agreed. And this was about a half mile of frontage with another parcel that they could buy, another 100 acres. So a total of 199 acres of this land that we're standing on right now could be bought for $2,000.
Oh my God.
Remember, this was 1921. It's 100 years ago. Things have changed a lot, including the value of the dollar. But even then, it was a small part of the average annual wage then, whereas it would be a huge part today if you did the same thing. Wouldn't it be nice if it were still available? So they bought it. And that happened they took out an option on the property in December 1921. A few days later, they exercised that option. And then a few weeks after that, in January 1922, they bought that other acreage for the total of 199. Let me see where I am with this. Oh, yeah. So you see the picture of the original cottage in your booklet, and right below that is a picture of three young people, three almost teenagers. One is a teenager for sure. On the far left is Carlotta's and AE's only daughter, Doris. Does anyone remember Carlotta at all? Probably not. She died 50 years ago. Okay, Joe does. Good. Yeah, and Doris, probably more. Some people remember Doris, perhaps. Yeah, good. Well, Doris was born in 1898. So this picture was taken in 1913. And I just love the stance she has there. Look at that stance carefully with a cane, walking stick out there, and she has an imperial pose that kind of dominated the scene. Next to her is an adopted cousin in a sense, that they were friends, but they always considered him a cousin. His name was Wyford Worth, and he was a resident of Grand Rapids. His mother was Sarah Worth, and it was Sarah Worth who bought another 30-acre parcel in the old wilderness and built the cottage next to the Ewing cottage. And then at the far right is Walkley with, I think, a hatchet in his hand. He was a Boy Scout, so he was always prepared for whatever came along, including chopping down branches. And another thing to notice in that photograph, and then the one on the next page, is how bare the dunes were. Remember that this was 1921. The last trees in this area, Rosie Mound and around here, were harvested around 1890. So even though this is 23 years later, still very sparse growth. When the lumbermen came in, they pretty much clear-cut everything. So what we have around us today are second growth, but look how big they are now. Those are big trees, they're maturing, and as we discussed at the association meeting this morning, some of them are dying and some of them are being pushed down by the wind, and that's the result of their age too, and disease. Below that picture of the wooded dunes lumbered out is a wilderness presence. And my dad was a craftsman. He loved to build things. He liked to make signs. And one of the signs he made said, wilderness. And there's another one that's on the front of, or in the first part of that now section of the book, which it shows the entrance to the wilderness, and it has a wilderness sign over it. That was made out of sticks and branches that my dad put together. And that was there for a long time. You know, those beech trees outlasted the sign. And there used to be, the sign was hung by a chain. And there was a beech tree on one side of the drive up the hill, the first hill, and one on the other side. And for years, one tree came down a long time ago. The other beech tree had that chain hanging for a number of years. I think maybe 15 years or so ago, that tree had to come down. So all that evidence is now wrong. How did the wilderness get its name? Now, not unusual to call woods the wilderness, but this wilderness has a special meaning. And its name came from what's called a quatrain from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. In 1851, Edward Fitzgerald translated, Omar Khayyam was a 11th century Persian poet. And Edward Fitzgerald, Englishman, translated it. And it fascinated people. It's a long, many rubaiyats, many quatrains. And one of them is this one on the page that says, a book of verses, underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Wilderness, or paradise enow. What does enow mean? Who knows? All right, it has nothing to do with the digital age. That is not digital shorthand for something. The E-N-O-W means simply what we would call today enough, enough. And at one time would mean a little more than that, ample, plenty, sufficient. So it was paradise in total, everything. And that's how the village was named. The cottage, let's see, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the seventh photograph over at the top there, and it's also here, I think, later, was the first Ewing cottage. And the drive, as it is today, which it's now the Shaw cottage, you drive up the back of the house, and we used to have a sign painted there with that quatrain on it, just as a constant reminder why this place is called the Wilderness. In 1926, Carlotta hired ABC Airlines out of Lansing to take aerial photographs, an innovation at that time. The aerial photograph, I think, had begun in the World War I, but it really hadn't taken hold yet as a common photographic technique until about the mid-20s. And she had a series of photographs taken, and what you see up there is one of them. And if I'm not sure how clear your picture is in the book, but the one I have here is kind of fuzzy, but it's if you look carefully, you can see the original Ewing cottage up a little bit from the beach, and then just below that, close to the beach, is the Oatman cottage, and then farther down is what I think I called it the Coulter cottage in the book, but actually I believe it is Dick Elleveld's cottage. It's now the Howard's property. And that was built in 1925. Belknap's and the Kimball's cottage, 1927. The Travis cottage, now the Booth, 1927 also. And the Coulter cottage actually was built in 1929. Well, you see, I love maps. So I love air views. So there's another air view. And that's from way above, that's probably done by a satellite, this one. And if you look, you can see the beach, and you can see all the wilderness trails, including the old lumbering trails. The roads that you come in, most of those were lumbering trails. And when they lumbered the woods here, is what they followed to get the lumber out, get the timber out. And you can see Lakeshore Drive, Lincoln Street, and you can just barely follow Wilderness Trail if you look closely at that. Among the early cottage owners here were the Travis family, C.C. and Rose Travis. And they, in 1927, C.C. designed and Rose hooked this rug The rug is still in the Travis family, but it's now descendants. But it is now hanging on a wall in Detroit, and I was thankful I could get a picture of it. But it's interesting, if you look at it, we won't go through it all now, but you see what we call Lakeshore Drive is then called Sheldon Road, and that's how I remember it's Sheldon. And US 31 was there, the railroad was there, and a lot of the topography that you saw in those aerial views also show up on that design. And there's the picture of the first Ewing cottage. And it's interesting, if you go by that cottage recently, say since October, you'll notice that it's been under renovation. And because of scarcity of materials, labor, and I guess that has not been completed. And there's no sign of when it will be completed. But what I found particularly interesting, I always remember the cottage had a picture window and it had shingles. And it was kind of a surprise to see when they took the shingles off, right down to the original clapboard. And the picture window, which was an innovation at the time when Carlotta and AE installed that picture window, was something new. And you can see those are conventional windows that are in this picture. Ed Hine deserves a place in the history of the wilderness because he built some of these cottages, and he also built the fieldstone fireplaces, like the one that's in this picture here, and it's on the fence down there. They were, I think there are 5 of them that he built, and I don't know if you could even get that done anymore. Probably somebody could do it, but he did a marvelous job, and he almost became a resident of the wilderness because he was here so much, building cottages and building the fieldstone fireplaces. And if you have an opportunity to read the history book that distributed earlier, you'll get more of his, a better idea of his work than that. Next is this second Ewing cottage, which is now the Altman cottage. And that was built in 1927. And that's the Ewing family that's gathered up there before I was born, but not much. And down below is the Little White Cottage. And if you see the, I'll go back here. There's a photograph here. That was a little cottage that was built, well, right about where, just below where Hiles are today, in the dune. And my father, I don't know how he did this, and I was born during the Depression, and times were bad. My dad was out of work, gonna have a baby. They didn't have any place to live, so Carlotta and AE put the family up, and I had one brother and 2 sisters. I wasn't born yet. And they all lived at what is now the Shaw Cottage for the winter. It's not insulated. There was a fieldstone fireplace. As far as I know, that was their only source of heat. My siblings went to Rosemount School down by Rosemount, and that's where they lived when I was born. But somehow got by, and it worked. And then despite the Depression, in 1937, my father, his mother approved him building a small cottage in that dune, approximately a quarter mile across what the family called the gorge, that open expanse of sand. And at that time, it had a lot fewer trees than we have on it now. And he built that little white cottage by hand. There was no electricity, no running water, no gas. He put in a kerosene stove. We brought kerosene. We would buy, when we came here for vacations, buy ice, chunks of ice in Grand Haven. And then cars had bumpers that stuck out, not like they're built in today. They had bumpers that stuck out. Stick that chunk of ice between the bumper and the radiator, drive to Carlotta's cottage, Shaw Place, have tongs and carry that ice across the gorge to that little white cottage and put it in the icebox. And I would think by the time he left between the time he left Grand Haven and got to the little white cottage, that chunk of ice must have been I guess it worked. They did all right. And we had such wonderful memories there. And that's another talk I could give, but we'll skip by that. Okay, moving along. Then I'll finish the little white cottage story. In 1950, Carlotta decided it was time to develop the South End. Remember that my grandfather was an attorney, and he didn't make much money. And what he did make usually was he took goods in trade for his services. And often it would be food, maybe people pulled carrots out of their garden, and sometimes apparently it was Victrolas. Now I don't know why. Victrolas were cheap. You know what a Victrola is? It plays phonograph records with a big speaker with his master's voice. And sometime early on, Carlotta told AE, "There shall be no more Victrolas. We need money. We need cash. We can't do anything with these Victrolas." So also what happened was that as they bought this 199 acres, that marvelous lake frontage, and they began to sell lots. And the lots that they sold were their retirement fund. It was an excellent retirement fund. The Carlotta vetted everyone that wanted to buy. You had certain rules that you had to buy. She was an early environmentalist. She was very concerned about preserving the woods and not building outside of the woods line. Nothing on the dunes. And she made sure that people understood that and that they would abide by those rules. And almost up until her death in March 1971, she enforced those rules. Her will was the law. And people had no problem with that. And I think because of her foresight, because of her wisdom, because of her devotion to the environment, it's why we have this beautiful wilderness that we have today. We thank her for that. Okay, yeah. All right, now I already mentioned the gorge, and that's that sandy expanse. The family had names for almost everything. And the Valley of the Pines there's a picture of the Valley of the Pines there. It's the fourth from the right. Was a magnificent, secluded glade just below the Ewing house. It's now what is behind the Deans and the Sheridans. At that time when I was a boy, those were beautiful white pines growing there. They were tall, majestic. Somehow they got missed in the lumber. They were probably original pines. They had to be. They have since decayed and rotted and gone. And there was even a marriage down there. For a long time, there was a bronze plaque on one of the trees about the English daughter that got married there. And I wish I knew where that bronze plaque was. I would love to have it as part of our artifacts. But anyhow, good things happened at that Valley of the Pines. Another one was let's see, what do we have next? Thank you. The gorge, okay, we talked about that. Let me see if I can get myself. Here we go. Yeah, talked about the gorge. And then the Wilderness Beach. About 1967, Doris felt that the people who lived back, like where the knolls are and the other people back in there, McElwees and so forth, should have a beach that they could go to. They had no lake frontage. So working an arrangement out with the Wilderness Association, she gave 550 feet of beach roughly between Dean's South Line and Hiles North Line for general use. And now, because there are more cottages built back, the beach is used even more than it used to be. But that is what's called the Wilderness Beach, and that's the photo that I took probably 40 years ago, of what it looked like then before there were any cottages in view. We are environmentally conscious in the wilderness, and that the water graph that you see there, the water level for Lake Michigan and Port Huron, or Lake Huron, show the erratic levels of the lake. And this, I think, goes from about 1918 to 2020. And we had lows and we have highs, and in between there's a lot of fluttering. Last year we had very high water, as you know. I think it's gone down, but I wonder if the heavy rains of last week are going to raise that water level back up. It might.
2 inches. 2
inches up?
But the water will fall projected within a week.
Oh, is that
so
right?
the rivers will fall, so we'll see how much it'll rise.
Thank you. All right. So it's about 2 inches. It's come up since those rains fell, but it will go back down probably. Now, many of you probably remember the Westons. They had a cottage. They were the first people to live in the wilderness year-round. They owned that cottage before that, and they were from Grand Rapids originally. Although he took a job as pharmacist with the D&W grocery store here in town and worked there for a number of years. But anyhow, Mr. Weston knew about a city hall that was coming down. And you see that picture also. That is the Grand Rapids City Hall that was built in 1888. In 1969 or late 1968, the Grand Rapids City Council said, that building is no longer safe, we have to take it down. We're going to tear it down. And there was a lot of protest. It was a good building, good-looking building, strongly, sturdily built. But it was the wisdom of the city fathers that it had to come down. So, but despite the protest, it did. And the wrecking company that took it down salvaged what they could. And they put it in their yard, in their lumber yard. The Westons knew about that. And in January, the building came down in 1969. And in January, they went to this scrapyard and they saw a flagpole. And if you look at the City Hall picture, you'll see that flagpole. And down below is a picture we took this spring of the same flagpole. And that is what was flying at the Grand Rapids City Hall until the Westons rescued it. They brought it to Grand Haven, floated. They got, the legend is anyway, that the 1972 football team, Grand Haven High School, helped the Westons float it down the Grand River and then carry it up the dune, put it in place on that concrete platform. Wow. And that's a story. If you look carefully, look at the picture of the recent picture, and you see the globe up to the top. That's an original globe that was on the flagpole when it flew over the City Hall. And the people who live there now are still flying that flag when they are here. It was a great occasion. In fact, I write a little column for the Grand Haven Tribune called Remembering Our Past, and I'm going to feature this. I won't mention the wilderness because we don't want to do that, but I am going to just give the story of the flagpole.
I'll be darned.
1969.
And where's the flagpole?
Where's the flagpole? Oh, Van Barons. Yeah, Van Barons.
Next to the Ohio.
Oh, you don't know the listen. Oh, I'm sorry. That's Van Barons. Now, please, now.
We look at it every day.
And we end with a famous quilt. In 2002, These tennis courts were not in the shape they are in here today. In fact, they were pretty bad. And there was an effort underway to raise money so that they could be fixed up. And a quilt contest was a lottery was held, a drawing. And various people from the wilderness were asked to submit squares. And let's see, Lynn Bullington and Juanita Sheridan, and who else was it? Was somebody else was involved. So anyhow, Lynn and others put that together. Was it Diane Donnelly? Was that the one?
No, Juanita.
Well, what, there were three of you.
Well, actually, it ended up to be just Juanita.
Okay. Oh. Okay. All right. That's good. So there's look at that quilt. There's a lot of history in that. That is a pretty brief summary of how we got to where we are today. If you have questions, I'm here to try to find answers. And if you have any interest in those enlargements that are up there, feel free to put your name on them. I think a lot of them are already spoken for. But if there's anything that's available that you want, there's a list to the left, and you can put your name on that. Are there any questions about those photographs? Okay, I think we've done it. Thank you.